Wait, where? What? I'm in a box!
Oh no. No, not the box.
This is the Escape the Zoo podcast. With your host, Daniel Clark.
Thank you so much for taking the time. To be honest, it might take me a second to get into this. I'm having a little bit of a fanboy moment here just because I've been following your work for a really long time at this point and am just a massive fan. So thank you again for taking the time to chat with me.
Not a worry, my pleasure.
I think a cool way to kind of provide an overall context as the work that you do would be to tell the story of the necklace that you wear with the hook.
Not a worry. A lot of the work I do actually takes me to the front lines, often to some very remote locations and not infrequently some dangerous locations. In 2008, I was working with CNN and Anderson Cooper team, and we were in Cocos Island doing trying to expose what was happening with the illegal longlining happening in a World Heritage Site. And though this was meant to be a protected area, despite a lot of conservation groups really trying to push for that to happen, we were seeing up to 40 longliners a day, wrapping up to 1,000 miles of longline around this 1 3-mile island. Longline is basically buoys with line attached to it that stretch out behind a boat. And those lines can be somewhere between 4 miles and on big vessels up to 100 miles long. And then dangling down from each of those lines, spread out, are individual lines with baited hooks. So a long line could have thousands of baited hooks, and they're targeting high-value marine species like tuna, swordfish, marlin, and often sharks.
Miles long?
Up to 100 miles long.
Oh my God. I had no idea.
Yeah, the Taiwanese fleet has enough long line to wrap around the planet 8 times around the equator.
Holy shit.
So we're talking monstrous, insane numbers of hooks in the water from just one fleet.
Yeah.
So a lot of the vessels in Costa Rica are also Taiwanese or Chinese or even Costa Rican. And we were trying to raise the alarm bells about how bad the situation was in this World Heritage Site. So we would go out at like 2 a.m. every day and go out in our chase boat, and on our radar screen would just be blip, blip, blip of dozens and dozens of vessels, and they would see us coming, and it was a cat and mouse, and unfortunately it was 1 against 40. So we'd be on one side of the island, they'd be on the other.
Right.
And ultimately by morning, we would have chased enough out, and it was now time to collect. So we'd spend the next 7 to 8 hours pulling in miles and miles and miles, maybe 40, 50 miles of long line a day, pulling in that was basically being confiscated. And on those lines were all kinds of species that we discussed. And one of them had, well, there were many sharks, but one of them had a live silky shark on it. And I remember in the water seeing it and was struggling on that line. And we pulled it up the side of the boat, and with some pliers, we managed to work that hook out and set that shark free. And a lot of people would say, what's the point? There's thousands of miles of long line out there in just this one area. What difference are you making? And I always say, for that shark, it made a lot of difference. It was life and death to that one shark.
Right.
And for every one that we save and release, it matters. And I think that's sort of right now the principle that I use for conservation. We have an uphill battle. We're losing a lot of ground. But for every place and every species that we save, we're making a massive impact.
Geez, that's amazing. So you released the shark, and then you took that hook and actually turned it into a necklace?
Yeah, so here's the hook right here. And this hook is sort of my hook of hope. It's one less hook in the water, and it's better to have it around my neck than to have this hook catching endangered wildlife.
And I've heard that's also kind of helped save you in a couple moments too.
Yeah, the nature of my work, I'm often working in remote areas where you have parties or groups that have no interest in having their business documented. And often that involves triads and mafia and all kinds of people that you don't want to cross. And there's been more than one occasion where I've been out in the field, and this hook has played an instrumental role in helping guide me through some very difficult scenarios, for the simple fact that I can use it to basically establish a level of rapport. Who else would wear a hook around their neck other than a fisherman?
Right.
So for me, it means something very different. But for the people that I've dealt with, they think I'm a compadre. I'm a fisherman.
And do they not want their work documented from the sheer fact that obviously it's a pretty gruesome practice, or is it oftentimes illegal within the areas that it's being done?
All of the above. It's brutal. It's absolutely wasteful and destructive. You're talking about slicing fins off an animal, so you're taking just a few percentage points of that animal's body mass. Often the rest is either thrown overboard to die or used as fertilizer or dog food or something low value. It's really the fin that they're after, and that fin is worth so much money. And as a result of that, you've seen shark populations around the world absolutely plummet. It's a free fall. So with the sort of advent of shark legislation starting to go into various countries and international regulatory bodies, the last thing the people that are perpetrating these crimes want is it to be seen in the public, because it puts more pressure on them to not do what they're doing.
Oh, so even while the policy's starting to be gaining ground on a legislative front, it's important for them to hold back the media's attention, because obviously it'll gain more steam if people see the brutality of it.
The truth is very bloody, much more than you ever typically see on television. And the losses to marine life are horrendous. So they will defend their practice with, they'll kill for it. And you've got to make sure you're not in the way of that gun or machete.
And so sharks in particular versus species that we're used to seeing on our own plates from a fish standpoint, why do they struggle more than, let's say, a typical cod or that you're putting on your plate?
Sharks have a very unique role in the ecosystem. They've survived 4 mass extinction events. The dinosaurs went extinct 75 million years ago. Sharks have been on Earth for 400 million years.
Oh my God.
So we're talking some of the most ancient, long-lived family of species on this planet. And they've evolved singularly in the oceans as the apex predator to keep that system in balance.
Right.
And in order to fulfill that role, they have very unique biological characteristics that prevent them from ever being overpopulated. So they're very slow to mature. They give birth to very few young. They have relatively low metabolisms. And that makes them able to occupy that top realm without producing too many. Now, what happens is when you hunt the sharks, the species right below them, which don't have those biological controls built in, explode. And they basically then devour everything beneath them. So you get what is called a trophic cascade, or a systematic collapse on the levels below. So you really can't replace sharks. There is no replacement. And as a result, we have a massive imbalance now within our oceans, and it's only getting worse.
So have you noticed, since I feel like Racing Extinction and a lot of the work that you've done has really garnered a lot of attention recently, have you seen kind of progress on that front, or is it continuing to decline?
I think there is a lot of progress. We've seen a lot of movement on the international front. There's a group called CITES, which is a regulatory body, a UN body of about 180 member nations. So a lot of the world's countries. And that group is tasked with putting international trade restrictions on endangered species. It's called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And in 2013, after a massive campaign, we succeeded in getting manta rays listed, along with a couple other shark species. Since then, we have now steamrolled ahead, and we have over 20 now shark and ray species that we've added at the 2016 meeting.
Hell yeah.
Combined. And so we now have this constraints going into place, and it's then being taken to the nations that are the largest perpetrators to try to get them now to enforce the trade bans. So progress is happening. It's not happening fast enough. There are risks to that progress. There's a resurgence of a philosophy called sustainable shark fisheries.
Yeah.
And what certain scientists would like us to believe is that sharks should be managed just like any other fishery. But their biological characteristics already preclude that in any sense, whereas a tuna releases millions of eggs, a shark can only produce a few young. And they point to maybe one example that they can ever find of a singular shark fishery that may appear as sustainable, even though it's not even definitively so. And then they use that as a theoretical basis to try to justify managing all sharks as sustainable. That philosophy has no practical roots. And if we can't even manage tuna and grouper stocks that have high productive rates, how the heck are we ever going to manage shark stocks in the same way? So it's a dangerous trend that is starting, and just like everything else in conservation, you feel like you're making a lot of headway, but even within the ranks, you have people that start undermining it.
Yeah, well, I think that's what scares me the most is you see some of the documented footage of mass spawning of tuna and snapper, and we're talking, like you said, millions of eggs, and the mass of fish that can be created in 1 year is like, oh, okay. And then when you see that those populations are also struggling just because of the mass demand for tuna, particularly in Japan, it's terrifying to think that sharks reproduce on such a lower frequency and the tuna is still struggling. So you got to imagine the sharks are on the brink.
Their populations have declined, the large pelagic species, by 90 to 99% across most of their habitats.
Damn. So I was under the assumption that I had heard like a really big success story that ever since the shark fin soup was kind of put into the spotlight with Yao Ming's campaign and Wild Aid, and he was talking about the devastation as to why you shouldn't eat shark fin soup, that in China particularly that a lot of that had declined recently, and I always thought it was a lot more promising than it sounds like it is.
Well, let me comment on that. If without that work of Wild Aid, and I helped with the Yao Ming campaign with the fin shark material, but Wild Aid has had a very prominent campaign in China now for close to a decade. That work has been instrumental in taking severe pressure off an already collapsing system. Mm-hmm. And a 70 to 80% decline in shark fin demand in many instances has been recorded. And that's super important because without that, it would be hopeless. Now, the fact of the matter is, with that, though, we still have way too many people consuming a vastly diminished, if you take 30 years, but it's even been longer, of industrial fishing that has taken close to 100 million sharks every year, you're talking about 3 billion sharks gone from the oceans. The percentages are now in the 1 to 10%. There is absolutely no way we can sustain any level of intensive shark fisheries. And right. Even with 20% left in the demand in China, you also have all the demand for their skin and their bones and their cartilage, not their bones, their cartilage and their meat. So the fact is we need it on all fronts. We need every area that we can eliminate the fisheries for sharks as quickly as possible if these populations are to even have a chance.
Is there a way that your average person can help to support these efforts?
I think a lot that we can do. First and foremost is if you're in a country that consumes shark fin soup, don't, and pressure others to not consume it. In the U.S. right now, there is a bill that's being pushed forward by Oceana that is to basically eliminate the trade in shark fins. That could be an incredibly powerful one. Unfortunately, another set of organizations have combined with the Fisheries Group to create a counter bill that is the Sustainable Shark Fisheries Act, which will basically be status quo. So you need to support the right bill and the right actions, which actually does as much work as possible to eliminate the profitability of the fishery, which was what the Oceana bill is looking to do. Mm-hmm. So putting pressure, writing your congressmen and senators to make sure that happens is often something you can do as well. Third, if you consume fish, particularly if you consume tuna fisheries are one of the largest, it is the most profitable and large fisheries in the world. 45% of global fisheries value is tuna. In tuna, you have massive, massive bycatch to the tune of tens of millions of sharks every year being caught in these tuna fisheries in the longline and purseiners. So if you're consuming longline or purseine caught tuna, you're killing sharks and turtles and rays and whale sharks and all those things. The only real sustainable types of tuna that you can catch right now are ones that are caught on pole and line, which means a boat with guys, a single line, a hook, and they're catching a single tuna at a time because there's no bycatch in those fisheries. But for the most part, your decisions as a consumer can have a massive impact on shark populations.
What about some of those? I know particularly in Australia, they have some of those like tuna pens where they essentially have these massive bubbles that they keep tuna in and can go in and swim and take them out that way. Is that sustainable?
Those are wild caught juvenile bluefin tuna. So Southern Pacific tuna, bluefin tuna is now less than 3% of its pre-industrial value. So 97% in the last 60 years decline in southern bluefin. So instead of going and catching the last big ones, they go catch all the juveniles that are schooling and they haul them back in a net and then they raise them using fish feed, which is coming right out of the ocean, and then they sell it to Japan. So it is an environmental crisis type scenario.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about? about what the process is when I've seen you in processing plants, in finning camps? How do you even get into those places? And can you talk a little bit about what the process is for a lot of these shark camps and how they actually do process them?
Yeah. So I'll talk about, first of all, how they work, and then about getting into them. So it's a strip mining mentality, which means, or the gold rush, in that there's a bunch of people, there's a large number of people chasing ever diminishing shark populations. And so nobody thinks it's sustainable in any sense, but if they don't take it, somebody else will, so why not? So everybody's working as hard and as fast as they can to catch every last shark, including all the babies. And they either are using nets or they're using hooks. And often they use drift nets, even off California, and pretty much wherever there's a coastline, or they use long lines, baited hooks that either float just below the surface or at some depth or even on the bottom. Those then they set at night, which is the most likely time where these animals are feeding, and then they haul them in. And certain shark fisheries are fin-based, which means they hack the fins off the live animal, they throw it back in the water, and that animal, depending on the type of shark, can live for anywhere between hours or weeks, suffering and slowly suffocating.
Oh my God.
It's a really barbaric practice. And then once they bring them back, they set up drying racks. And in the artisanal, smaller scale fisheries, they have wooden sort of rattan racks that sit on beaches, and they dry all the fins there. In the commercial ones, they throw them into freezers, and then when they get to places like Hong Kong or Taiwan, they offload them with forklifts, and then they have these massive fin drying facilities where in a single view, you'll see literally 10,000 fins drying in the sun. From there, those fins are taken into a processing room where they scrape all the skin off, and they get the cartilage, which are little threads in that fin. So imagine you have a shark, and less than 5% is the fin weight. So you've already discarded 95% of the animal. Then you take that fin and you discard all the material around it just to get to the few percentage points that are the cartilage threads. Those are then processed, cleaned, and then they're sold to consumers in restaurants, primarily restaurants, and they're used as like a thickening noodle in a chicken broth-based soup, and they're basically tasteless. So the flavor of shark fin soup is a chicken broth and other flavors. And so, in fact, there's no actual intrinsic value to that other than it's a status symbol. And because of that, we're obliterating the apex predator, 400 million years of evolution, for a tradition.
And that's what is the most frustrating part about a lot of the illegal wildlife trade is it's all based in a bunch of like bullshit practices. You know what I mean? It's like from rhino horn to shark fin, there's not even like a net benefit to a lot of obviously there's zero net benefit in general, but you could understand if there was a genuine health benefit or there was a genuine taste or product that you could make out of it. But the fact that there's literally zero value in a lot of these things is just like the biggest shocking smack in the face. Yeah. Yeah.
It's the health benefits are actually not only negligible, but in the case of shark fin, they're mercury and lead and other toxins. So it's actually bad for your health. And it's not just sharks. It's just about any species where their numbers are by definition limited, where you can take a part of that animal, you can dry it, and you can ship it and transport it, and then you can sell it in dry seafood stores. And a lot of this demand is completely fabricated. Before the mid-1980s, when China was still closed, nobody was consuming shark fin soup. But with the sort of opening of China, what was considered a very rare delicacy, the emperor's dish, suddenly became something that a few traders realized they could profit from. And there, in the 80s, the shark fin industry exploded. So it's one of those things where it's really industry driven. You're talking about a supply chain that you're trying to push as much product into. And as that product diminishes the supply curve, the price goes up. And so you make money all the way until there's nothing left. And you make more and more money as per unit. So the traders are always looking for new products. And, rhino horn and ivory have been long staples, but tiger bone and bear gallbladder and manta gills and shark fins. And now they're taking parts of giraffes and zebras, and eventually they'll take everything.
It's barbaric.
And it's not consumer driven because the consumers didn't even know they wanted it. It's marketing driven, where you have industrial barons, traders that are driving it into the shelves, marketing it, and then suddenly people think they want it. It's a fashion play.
Right. And from the general consumer standpoint, is it a lack of knowledge as to what's going on? Do you think a lot of it is just kind of fed through culture, but not what the background is to the true impact, or is it an apathy?
I think there's 3 levels that we deal with. There's ignorance, there's apathy, and there's greed. Ignorance is, for the most part, most people are just unaware of the consequences of their actions. That's your average person. And it's one that has to be addressed through education. However, often when people are educated, they turn out to be apathetic. And that's basically the belief that either it's not a big deal, it'll take care of itself, or someone else will fix it. And that's a great excuse to lead to inaction. What can I do? It doesn't make a difference what I do. I might as well eat it. And you hear that when you go into a restaurant, they say, well, the fish is already dead. I might as well order it.
Right.
It's your ordering it that drives the fish to be dead.
Right.
So that apathy is something that is prevalent through our society, and it's because we lack empathy. We lack a fundamental empathy for things outside of ourselves, barely our closest family, slightly extending to our nearest network, but certainly not to other animals or other beings. And so the lack of that connection and empathy means we can allow all kinds of horrific things to happen to other people and other animals and beings, and we don't do anything about it. That can be addressed by really creating connective storytelling that enables people to start feeling, and Hollywood does that with other issues quite well. So really connecting people to the consequences of their actions, but also to the fact that these beings are sentient, intelligent life forms that deserve something other than a cruel death. The final one is greed. And greed is regardless of ignorance or apathy. It doesn't matter. I know it's terrible. I'm making money on it. I don't care. It's sort of the industrial baron model. And really, the only thing that really stops them is you've got to crush the finances, which means make the demand unprofitable. And then you need strong laws and consequences, so when the rule breakers do step in, that they pay the price.
Yeah. And I think through my conversations with a lot of photographers and cinematographers like yourself, it's a really difficult balance, and one that I'm really interested in your perspective on, because you have some of the most beautiful underwater footage I've ever seen in the world of manta rays and mobulas and sharks, really all underwater. And then some of the most horrific, awful, eye-opening, smack you over the face conservation issues of these shark finning plants and ray harvesting, etc. Where do you find the balance of, you want people to engage and understand that it's a doom and gloom situation and kind of be like, oh my God, we need to do something. But at the same time, I think the beauty and showing the beauty of these animals is so important because it gets people to care in the first place. How do you find that balance?
It's interesting. I have a philosophy that I call strong medicine in small doses. And it works like this. We need to, first of all, make people aware of the beauty of the oceans. And so I have, some of that surreal natural history imagery that shows the beauty of these whale sharks, whales, mantas, dolphins, marine life reefs, all the kinds of things. So we're opening their eyes, right? We then need to connect them so they feel a deep sense of appreciation, but also something within them that love starts to grow. And that's where I do my human subject juxtaposition imagery, where you have a human interacting with the animal. So that person can imagine that it's them being that person. And the vulnerability and the connection that is represented in that image is something that they then feel themselves. It's almost like when you watch a movie, someone dies, the person you see crying is what makes you sad. The pain that one person feels, you feel. That's called empathy. So stirring that empathy. And then we have to also point out the fact that there is a significant and imminent threat right now. And that's where the strong medicine comes. And that is the hard imagery, but I do it in a way that I try to make it complex and structurally interesting, almost like fascinating. But when you dig deeper into it, you start to reveal the horror. That this isn't a strange pattern. This is actually thousands of fins. This is the loss of thousands of sharks. This is the face of 100 million sharks a year. So, but you can't beat people over the head and shame and guilt them. So the idea is make them aware, make them feel deeply connected. From that, give them that one bit of strong medicine, that gut punch.
Yeah.
That everything you just started to fall in love with is at risk. And then from there, you harness that empathy, that feeling of pain they're feeling, and you try to engage them, because ultimately, it's not about hope. I don't believe the word hope is very useful in conservation, because that means I hope something or someone else is going to fix it. If you always finish the hope sentence, right? I hope, it doesn't have to do with you. It has to do with someone or some other circumstances. I believe in inspiration.
Right.
I want people, once they feel that empathy, to be inspired, breathe in, and then they act, do something. Because that's what's going to save the oceans. Not hope, but action.
I agree entirely. And I think unfortunately, when people lose that connection and don't have the means or have not had the ability to gain that empathy, when you see the negative stuff, it's very easy to turn off immediately because it's depressing and it's sad and it's hard to understand how you can help until you start looking at things like what you've created to engage people to care in the first place. And I think it's a really hard balance to find, but I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there. But it's inspiring enough people to understand that one more person saying, "Oh, I can't do anything," is just furthering the rapid decline that we have going on.
Jacques Cousteau made it very simple. He said, "We protect what we love." He didn't say we love what we protect. Mm-hmm. And a lot of organizations start with these: the rainforests are burning down. Well, that's trying to get someone to act before they love. So it's a very simple formula: make people fall in love again with nature, and then they will be inspired to protect it. And then give them the action steps to do it. Where
did it start for you? When did you fall in love?
As a small child growing up in South Africa, watching these amazingly vibrant oceans with dolphins and sharks and humpback whales pouring up the coast every winter. And for me, the oceans were this magnificent, endless bounty. And it was only when I left the oceans as a young child, moved to America, that I missed them. And then returning to the oceans in beginning of college, beginning my scuba diver certification, what I had imagined was this amazing sea was now largely empty. And just in a little over a decade and a half, most of what I had loved had been stripped out.
Oh, so it was a tangible difference in that short period of time.
Shocking.
Damn.
We're not talking about decades and decades. We're talking about yearly losses that are insurmountable.
Yeah, that's depressing.
It can be.
Yeah. And so the need was to kind of reconnect with the childhood, and then you kind of got this vast awakening when you were taking scuba certification. What was that for? To be a guide, or did you have expectations of wanting to do underwater cinematography?
I missed the oceans, and I wanted to get back there and really experience them. And what I missed when I first jumped in the Caribbean wasn't there. It was gone. And I remember sort of that resolution that said, I need to find if anything's left. And so it actually began as a pursuit of passion to actually see, was anything that I loved left in this ocean? And I started seeking out those last great places. And I became aware that a hobby of mine, which was terrestrial photography, could come into play in helping to document these last great stories. Mm-hmm. So I began using imagery to capture it. And I had a creative knack for it. And I quickly self-taught myself how to use more advanced camera systems and imagery management techniques and all that. And what started as a hobby combined with a passion for the oceans became my conservation pursuit, using imagery and storytelling to really drive change to protect the oceans.
And do those places exist where they haven't had the impact that the rest of the ocean have seen?
There's no place left untouched. Every single place in the oceans has been significantly touched. There are places that are still in great condition, though, massively better condition than most of the rest of the oceans. You have in Raja Ampat, Indonesia, the heart of the Coral Triangle, the epicenter of marine biodiversity, one of the last great relatively intact, and I say relatively intact marine systems, where about 40% of the reefs now are pristine. So 60%, even in the best places, still gone, right?
Right, yeah.
From bomb fishing and illegal fishing. You have the Ross Sea in Antarctica, which they just signed the Camelar Treaty to protect about 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, which has been under pressure from the toothfish fisheries, sea bass, but there's still large populations of penguins and other marine species that are there, whale rookeries and things like that. And you have places in the Bahamas where you have thriving shark populations as a result of really progressive commercial banning of commercial fishing practices and protection of species. And I can list some other places as well, but there are very special places left. They're few and far between. Only a few percentages of the ocean are actually even listed as protected, like is under some kind of MPV. We're talking 3 or 4% maximum. And even those are largely unpatrolled. So hardly any of the ocean is actually truly protected.
Are there areas that they're trying to change that, like genuinely patrolled marine protected areas that nobody can go into?
One area I work in Rajampat is an area called Misul. There's a resort, Misul Eco Resort, that has, I was part of the founding team where we set up a no-take zone in 2005. In just 7 years, biomass increased between 300 to 600%
Holy
in this
shit.
no-take zone. And we're talking about something, bigger than the 5 boroughs of New York City. It's a massive, it's 1,200 square kilometers. And shark populations now are 25 times greater directly within the no-take zone than outside of it. And this is a result of absolutely dedicated marine patrols by local community members that are part of a structured patrol system. So multiple patrol boats, police, army, all part of it to keep poachers out. And even in the face of that, we still have incursions. But obviously it has been a massive success because the numbers speak for themselves. There aren't many places on Earth that have that kind of recovery. There aren't any.
I always speak to this as kind of my one, I know hope is a tough thing to hang your hat on. But the one thing that I've seen that always encourages me is the fact that nature is incredibly resilient. So I think in the face of a lot of doom and gloom, which is obviously present, I know just from my own experience, I used to have a friend who cleared out lots to build houses on. And he hacked away acres of brush and undergrowth in Western Massachusetts. And then every 2 weeks, the rapidness that overgrowth would repopulate was really amazing. And it sucked for him because he had to keep hacking it back. But my hope is that you'll see similar things when certain areas are protected and just left alone.
Yep. The oceans in particular are because of the nature of a 3D marine system and the nutrients that are flowing in that system, the ability for rebound within the oceans is probably an order of magnitude greater than on land.
Really?
So given the chance and given the time and given the protection, we could see massive recovery. There are apex species like cod that have not yet recovered after decades of protection. Whales take hundreds of years for even whale populations to be a blink of what they used to be. And shark populations, some may never recover, but others could recover on in the order of decades to hundreds of years. So the apex species, the slow breeding species, take a very long time, but a lot of the faster producing species, the tuna, the mackerel, the sardines, those can recover very quickly given the time and space. And what happens is, unfortunately, once we start protecting areas, policymakers come and say it's recovered and they open them up again.
People love delisting things as soon as possible because it's a weird thing where they can hang their hat on a success and then
consume it.
Yeah, exactly.
We need to take 30 to 40% of our oceans need to be cordoned off absolutely and indefinitely. And those need to be the refuges for marine life that will then feed the rest of the marine systems. That's what needs to happen.
I'm about to ask a question that I guarantee to you is going to sound incredibly stupid as somebody who understands the ocean. But I've always had this perspective from myself, who's somebody who is an admitted layperson when it comes to knowledge of the ocean. And I'm asking this for people who might think the same as me, which is just because I haven't been to a lot of places and been to the ocean and observed a lot of places, you almost view it as one thing, like the ocean. So the idea of protecting certain nuggets or like little areas of that, to me, I'm wondering how much of the rebound is influenced by protecting that small area versus still being affected by the fact that everything surrounding that area is getting destroyed. Does that make sense?
Yep.
It's a hard question to phrase, but
there's all kinds of scientific terms like site fidelity, which means how much time a species spends in a certain spot, range of movement, how far they go. A lot of species, I'm accepting the open water pelagic species, are fairly localized. Even what we thought were high moving manta rays, the oceanic manta rays, turn out to spend most of their lives within a few hundred square kilometers.
Oh, really?
Don't range very far. So, except on the exception where one will do a random journey. So the fact of the matter is, by protecting localized areas, you can protect the vast majority of species in that area, even a lot of pelagic species. oceanic whitetips in the Bahamas. Turns out they range for a very small part of the year, and then they spend a lot of their time around the Bahamas. And that's why they're still there, because otherwise they would have been fished in all the other areas. So localized protection can make a massive impact. And then that combined with protections on migratory species in open waters can finish the job. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot to be done. There are things, however, that do not obey those laws. And one of them is climate. Acidification and water temperature know no boundaries.
Right.
And with the unrelenting increase in fossil fuels, despite all kinds of Paris agreements and all kinds of commitments, we are in runaway climate change mode right now for probably the next 50 years, even if we shut it all off, which we're not, which means temperatures are going to continue to rise. And for the oceans, not only temperatures, but CO2, of which oceans absorb half of. So the oceans are becoming much more acidification. And as a result of that, we're having reefs no longer able to even form, and shelled organisms becoming vulnerable and their shells not forming. Mm-hmm. That could be the finishing blow if we don't have resilient systems already in place. So the buffer to that is to have long-term, we have to turn off the faucet of carbon emissions.
Right.
Short-term, we need to buffer this system as much as possible, and you do that by protecting the diversity and abundance of species. The more there are, the more chances some of them will make it. The more diverse they are, the more diversity we have, the more chances within those populations, some will rise and some will fall. And right now what we're doing is doing selective annihilation of species. So we take out one by one by one, and then we're doing broad scale sweeping with destructive methods. So we're doing the exact opposite thing we need to do right now to buffer against climate change.
Yeah, it was a question I was going to ask, and something that obviously I don't agree with, but there would be that perspective of somebody saying, like, why is so much work being done if climate change is going to ruin everything in the long run anyways? And I think the answer to that is what you just said, which is we want to diversify and get the abundance up as high as possible, so that if it does take us time to correct course as a world, then we have the best shot possible. And just giving up on that is a pretty lame way to go out.
It's a very simple example that you can give people who say that. We're all going to die anyways, so why bother working on your life?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Why? You're going to die anyways. And as soon as you look at it from that perspective, you go, well, there's quality of life. There's quality of ocean.
Right.
Give all the reasons that you would give to try to improve your life and have a good life, even though you're going to die anyways, are the exact same reasons you can argue for other species and for the oceans.
Yeah, and I think it's it also goes back to you wanting to save that one shark. They say, well, the sharks are going to die anyways. It's like, yeah, well, that one's not going to anymore. You know what I mean? Could
you imagine if your boat capsized and you were with 10 people and 9 of them drowned, and the Coast Guard said, well, there's only one survivor, we're not going to bother?
It's ludicrous.
What would you say to that? What would the news say to that? You'd be like,
Fuck off.
It matters. It's so obvious when it's us. That's called empathy. So now make yourself that shark. As soon as you apply empathy, all the solutions and the answers become obvious. It's when you lack empathy that these silly arguments about we're going to lose it anyways, or species are going to go extinct anyways, those come up. It's because you honestly lack any empathy.
I think humans in general tend to empathize more with animals that they can humanize. And I think pets, even things like elephants and tigers and lions, things that just typically large mammals, right? And pets in particular. I think the oceans often struggle from that because it's very hard, I think, initially to humanize things like fish and rays and sharks until you start learning a little bit more about their behaviors. And I think if you deep dive on any particular species, for me, I got kind of an eye-opening moment when I started learning more about birds. And I was like, oh my God, these are amazing creatures with families and love lives and stuff like that. That's where you develop that empathy from. So I think for me, I would love for you to tell that story of the manta ray that you saved with the hook, because to me, that really helps to humanize sea creatures in a way that I had never done before or experienced before.
Sure. We were in Bali filming a series with one of my creative colleagues, Hannah Mermaid. She's an underwater performer and she's amazing. And we were trying to expose and create awareness around the destructive fisheries of manta rays in Southeast Asia, and also get people to feel a connection with them, someone actually swimming and engaging with them. And we were just wrapping up in Bali, our final day of shooting in the water. And I remember I looked down underneath me and I saw this large female sort of come below me, and she's just hovering right below me. And I'm sort of wondering why she's not going up on the cleaning station, why she's just sitting there. And then I looked down, I noticed this like line tailing off her face, and it was coming under her body and over her back, and it was tightly raveled and trailing about 20, 30 feet behind her. And I was like, uh-oh, this is trouble, because manta rays feed with their mouths, and it was done in a way that it was actually blocking her mouth from opening properly. So I called to a friend, I handed my camera over, and I swam down with scissors, and I snipped off some of that line, and it was painful because there was a hook embedded right in the top of her jaw, a big hook. And actually, this hook right here.
Oh my
Imagine
God.
this hook in your jaw, and it was covered in algae and blood, and I saw it there, and so I got part of it off, and I looked down, and she was still hanging out. So I swam down again, and I cut off all the way to the base of the hook, and I came back up, and I thought, well, now I've really, messed with her. She's going to swim off. She circled, and she was still there. So I go down again, and I take the hook, and I literally work it out of her top jaw, and you can see it's rubbed and cut and bloody, and it's really painful. And even though she sees me doing it, she lets me work that hook out, and I swim back up to the surface. And at this point, I think she's got to leave, because she's just now felt all the pain, and she's completely free. And I look, and she's still sitting there. I was like, oh my God. So I swam down, and I put my hand right on her head, right next to where the wound was. And I sort of patted her, and then I put my head right next to her eye. And I basically was saying, it's okay, you're going to be all right. And I just remember her little eye moving back and forth between my mask. And she was just looking, and I was like, I knew in that moment, I knew there was unquestionably that she had come for help, and that she knew that I was helping her. She knew I was there to help her. And only when that experience was done and we had that moment did she sort of flap up her wings and look back, and then she sailed off into the blue.
Oh my God, that's a beautiful story. I'm honestly like tearing up a little bit. I got to get myself together for that. But it
was amazing.
I think what's amazing about that too is when you think of the pain that animal must have felt when you were removing the hook, to still understand that you were doing a good thing for her is amazing. Because
even if you're dealing with a child and they have a splinter in their foot, it's hard enough for you to earn their trust, and you can speak to them, right? With her, there are no words, this manta ray. All we had was our ability between two species to share some energy, and she could read that I was here to help, and I could read that she was offering to be patient. And that kind of empathy, that kind of connection is what really finally makes one realize that these are highly intelligent, sentient beings, that they have their own existences, their personalities, and their lives, and each and every one of them is unique and is deserving of our respect and our protection.
100%. Man, I mean, if that type of story doesn't level you to a certain degree, then I don't know what can. So I think rays in particular are an interesting species, because within the conservation community, they've gotten a lot of attention over the last decade or so. But I think for the average listener, it's not a species that's typically on the radar. Or no. I listened to one of your talks. You had mentioned that most people would probably just think it's an oversized stingray. Can you explain a little bit about what's going on with rays? Why are they struggling, and why their protection is so important?
Yeah, so there's probably there's hundreds of species of different types of rays. Some that are little ones you see on the sand. Mm-hmm. Some of the are the giant southern stingrays, bull rays. But within them are a family called mobulids. And within the mobulid family are manta rays. And manta rays are a very unique species of ray. They're some of the latest to appear on the evolutionary timetable. In terms of, instead of hundreds or tens of millions of years, it's a few million years, which for sharks and rays is very new. Mm-hmm. And they're filter feeders. So they have no teeth. They have no barb like other stingrays, completely harmless. So the only way they are protecting themselves is their massive size. The reef manta rays grow up to like 14 feet, 15 feet across maximum. The oceanics, the wanderers, they can get as big as 25 feet across. So we're talking about
Wow.
massive creatures.
25 feet. Holy shit. That's huge.
It's like having a spaceship come in and hover over you. And these rays are also have the largest brain to body mass ratio of any shark array. So they have these dual lobes, just like human brains, with foliation, all the crevices, highly structured brains. And you only have highly structured brains when you need to actually apply and use it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very evident in their behavior. They're very social. They're very curious with each other, but also with human beings. And you wouldn't do that if you were just sort of this small-brained little animal. So they're coming in, they're connecting with us. And it's clear that they're using a lot of their brain for social behavior. Recently, some experiments were done. It's called the mirror awareness test. And dolphins and maybe a handful of other marine species have ever passed the test as self-aware. They actually recognize themselves in the mirror. No fish has ever done that. And manta rays and rays are under the fish, the sort of the category of fish. It looks to be that manta rays actually have self-awareness.
Wow.
Which would be not surprising to me in the slightest, but to scientists would be a big surprise. So amazing animals, and they also have, if sharks are biologically limited, manta rays are on a whole different order. They only have one baby every 2 to 5 years.
Oh my God.
And so maybe a maximum of 12 to 15 babies if a female lives her entire life, which doesn't happen anymore. So we're talking about very long-lived animals, very large, very vulnerable. They tend to aggregate on the surface to feed. And as a result, in the last several decades, 2 decades, they've become targeted. And somewhat for their meat, but primarily for a pseudo-medicinal tonic in China called penyusai, which is what I call extinction soup. It's dried manta gills, pipefish, and seahorse. And it's meant to cure like chicken pox and fever and aches and things like that. It has no basis even in the traditional Chinese medicine manuals. It was some coastal remedy that was revived by shark fin traders who, with the decline in their shark fins, were looking for other products. So as a result, you have populations like the entire Big Island of Hawaii's population is maybe 400 animals.
Mm-hmm.
You could wipe that entire population out in a few months that easily. And so they're highly vulnerable populations. And some populations have been completely extirpated. Others have declined by 85 to 90% like in Mozambique. And in a few short years, you could have seen the entire collapse of global manta populations. Fortunately, in 2013, we succeeded in getting protection for them at CITES after a hard-fought battle. And
congrats, that's huge.
We're seeing some real gains happening. And they're news within the conservation community now, but in the late 90s, and they were no news about them. And even as far back as like 2009, really nobody was talking about them. So it's pretty much in the last decade that all the conversation about manta rays has happened. And it shows that you can address an issue and you can put in real change in place on an international scale.
I think especially a heartening part of that too is that story in Racing Extinction where you went to the village, right? Where traditionally these people had hunted manta rays to be sold. And I think one of the hardest parts when it comes to conservation is you can kind of understand a native people's perspective of if this is the way they do things and have been doing them for however many years. There's a different level of interrupting their way of life versus like the Chinese wildlife illegal trade where they're just devastating species for sheer profit purposes. And I thought what was really encouraging was that when I was listening to that story and so much of their economy was based around the harvesting of these manta rays, I almost thought like, oh my God, how do you solve this problem? It's almost impossible. And you guys kind of did, right? It's, you have an island, a remote island community with 400 years of hunting tradition. Initially as whale hunters, but going way back, still opportunistically hunting manta rays with spears. And what was sort of an artisanal hand or sail fishery in the late 1990s, Chinese traders came in and it was transformed overnight into a commercial harvest using motorized boats catching 1,000 manta rays a year and literally within a few short years trying to obliterate the entire population. So you take 400 years of hunting tradition and a decade of commercial hunting and profit and try to turn that around. Incredibly difficult task. One of the hardest places I've ever worked. In the last 4 years, though, we've had a program
and it started before Racing Extinction, and it's continued and it's still going now. And we're working with Mosul Foundation, Sea Sanctuaries, and several other organizations. We've succeeded in reducing the targeted manta hunt by 97%.
Damn.
So there's a few still to be dealt with, but we're talking about massive reductions by both basically changing their relationship with the animals for a lot of the community, but also creating alternatives. So some of them, we presented opportunities in tourism. We presented a lot of opportunities in research. And then a lot of fishermen still want to fish. So developing sustainable handline fisheries for fast-growing species and moving them away from unpredictable, sort of high-yield, intermittent fisheries in megafauna.
Right.
So if you can do it there, you can do it just about anywhere.
Yeah, and I think that was such a beautiful thing for me because I was watching it and I genuinely, it was one of those things where I was like, how do you fix this? Because you feel sympathetic for the island community too, because that's their way of life. It wasn't necessarily a sheer greed play. And to be able to change something that people has been doing for 400 years and better their way of life in a more sustainable way, and something that will ultimately allow them to be supported for a lot longer is awesome.
Yep.
And I want to go back to kind of the recon work that you were doing. I'd imagine that within these communities, particularly on shark harvesting, that your face is pretty well known at this point in time. How do you get into these processing plants and finning camps and get the footage, especially with cameras, to kind of expose the truth?
Some of it's trade secrets that I won't go into too many details on. But in general, it's hiding in plain sight. People look for what they expect to see. And so you have to really leverage that. And it's sort of the magician's trick, right? If I have my hand over here, you don't know that there's a coin in this hand.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's about creating enough distraction and feeding them exactly what they expect to see so that I can capture the things that they don't want me to actually be capturing. And it's really complex social science, and it's confidence and it's navigation. A lot of research with some good safety fallbacks and a great team. And, I know I'm being vague, but it depends on the circumstances. You can be a tourist that's lost. You can be a researcher on a whole different issue. You can be a fisherman. You can be a lot of things. It just depends on the circumstances. But it needs to make sense in the context of, it needs to explain without question why you're there and why you're looking at what you're looking at. And people overcomplexify it, and it makes it very unlikely you're going to get anything you're actually trying to get.
Yeah. Have you had any dangerous situations there?
Have I?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had a lot of dangerous situations.
That was more queuing it up for, could you tell us about one or two of them?
Yeah, my family doesn't like to hear about these. I was in Ecuador documenting a large shark fishery, and we were in this town, and I remember we arrived in the town sort of in the mid-afternoon, and I remember looking over the seawall, and on that seawall was a beach, and these boats were pulling up with these sharks, and there was blood pouring out of the sides of the boats, and they were hacking the sharks up. And I had my little camera out on a tripod, a monopod, and I'm sitting there filming, and I made a mistake, which is I thought I'm in the middle of a city, open, safe.
Yeah.
What I didn't notice is there's a little Latin American juvenile gang, they call them piranha, which are these packs of teenagers that come in and they assault you, and it can be violent, and they rob you. And I look around and suddenly I'm surrounded by this pack of kids, teenagers.
Oh, God.
And they're armed with knives and things like that. And I was looking around and I realized I had not paid attention where my transport and my fixer was. And so I was completely isolated. So at that point, this is where training and experience become really important, but also just hold your ground. And so I didn't even acknowledge them, and I just kept looking through my thing, and I held my monopod right underneath my camera. And as they started closing in, I loosened the monopod till it was disconnected. And at one point, finally, the leader of the gang approached me, and he stepped right up, and I turned and I just flipped the monopod in the air, and I jammed it right under his chin. And I just gave him that crazy Mel Gibson kind of look, right? And he had his hand, he'd already reached into his hand for something. I don't know what kind of weapon it was. And he sort of pulled his hands out and he's like, hey, gringo. Hey. Mobs are about cowards. That's why they're in a mob. And often the biggest coward is the leader because he surrounds himself with the mob. And it wasn't whether I was going to beat all of them. It was that he was going to get his head knocked in. And he didn't want that. He's a coward. So they backed off momentarily, just enough time for my fixer to zip in with a taxi. And I hop in the vehicle and off we go.
Oh, God. That's smart, man. I don't know. I would have been... That's a good movie.
You got to know when to hold and know when to fold.
Yeah, jeez.
It can get intense. And those, most of the time it's uneventful and I try to keep it that way. I'm not an adrenaline or danger junkie in any sense. Mm-hmm. I don't want to I have a family and I have important work to do. I don't want to die.
Yeah.
But there are instances where best laid plans don't necessarily yield the outcome you're seeking. And, I've had those moments and they're not the best, but they happen.
Yeah, it's part of the job, I guess. Just try and limit them as much as possible.
Exactly.
I mentioned that, and we were discussing how rays really hadn't come to the media forefront until recently. Are there any species that are kind of laying low right now that deserve more attention as to the importance in kind of getting some policies and some work headed their way?
In all fairness, there's hundreds, if not thousands.
Yeah, that's true.
We're seeing a collapse of birds in the United States. We're seeing a collapse of insect populations because of pesticides. Every single species that I can think of other than cows and chickens and pigs that we're raising are getting pushed to the brink. We're replacing wildlife with farmed life. So, the list goes on, and, there's some that are not so obvious, like tuna, where we think there's endless tuna, but 5 of the 8 great tuna stocks have already collapsed or in collapse. And the next decade, we may see all of them in collapse. And with that goes close to half of global fisheries, close to $50 billion will suddenly fall out of the bottom of fisheries. And what happens when you suddenly lose that in poor and developing nations? If you talk about social unrest, you talk about not only food security, but financial security, you're talking about national security issues that we've never faced before.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of the windshield effect? Or the windshield phenomenon? It was an interesting, on one of my podcasts, do you know Tony Wu? So I was talking to him and he was mentioning how, just think about 20 years ago when you're driving down the highway, how your windshield would always just get covered in bugs. And now think about the last time you hit a bug with your car. And it's just like, to me, it really puts it in perspective because it used to be so common. You just get littered with bugs and now you hardly see any of them. And
even 10 years ago.
Yeah. And that's what they're talking about, is that nobody's paying attention to the fact that insect populations have dropped so substantially. And that's the bottom of the food pyramid, right? That's where a lot of the foundation is. Could be a mass problem going forward.
It's loss of habitat and agricultural development, but it's farming. We've lost half our rainforest, much more than half our rainforest, to development of land for pasture land.
What is the solution to that? Is that a lot more focused on like vertical farming and unique techniques to start taking agriculture out of the wildlife and putting it more into applying more technologies to be able to do it in a more sustainable way?
It's changing our diets. 70+% of agricultural land goes to feed livestock. Mm-hmm. And it's like a 4-to-1 or 10-to-1 ratio of efficiency, which means it takes 4 pounds of feed to get 1 pound, or 10 pounds of feed in some animals' instances to get 1 pound of meat. So it's a highly inefficient thing because most of that land we could also raise food or not raise food and leave it open. So I think it takes 1.5 acres to feed a vegan and like 30 acres to feed a meat eater.
Oh, really?
So people are like, there's not enough pasture land and everything. There's not enough land to fill crops to feed the world. It's completely backwards. There's not enough land if everyone were a carnivore. So the simple solution is plant-based diet. That is by far, it removes all the poaching. It removes all of the other things because you're no longer consuming all these wildlife products, and you're no longer converting land that would have been natural land into land to raise livestock. And you're actually letting go of a lot of land because you don't have all the livestock to feed. And so plant-based diet is probably the single most best thing we could do right now if we want to save species and habitats.
Yeah, it's like the double whammy of not only do you have all this land for the beef cattle and they're putting all this methane into the world, but you're also putting aside millions of acres of corn to be able to feed them in the first place.
It's terrible.
Yeah. I think
It's
the
terrible.
beef and the whole cattle industry in and of itself is probably could be the most detrimental thing to the planet right now possible.
Beef is probably the top of the food chain. It's the least efficient and most destructive, and it's large McDonald's level corporations that are literally paving over third world nations is massive. You have other things. Palm oil is destroying rainforests.
Mm-hmm.
It's consumption, unsustainable consumption of anything on scale can wipe out entire systems. And so, we don't just solve it with plant-based diet, but we get a hell of a long way there. And then you have to have conscientious plant-based diet, and then you're there.
Speaking of palm oil, I saw Paul Hilton speak probably about 6 months ago or something at a talk in Los Angeles. And he's doing a lot of that work around the loser ecosystem.
Yep.
I can never LOSA ecosystem. And he was talking about the palm oil destruction. And to me, what was awful is the large corporations that are still involved in decimating that area, like Procter and Gamble and Frito-Lay, and the biggest players in the world who have more money at their disposal to not be doing that type of shit so they can have a certain oil that's a little bit cheaper is just massively infuriating.
I was just talking to Paul last night. He's in a shark fishery right now. And despite a lot of progress, we still have large corporations that refuse to clean up their practices. And the reason being is that people keep buying their products and governments allow them to do it. If we had policy reform and we had consumer reform, they wouldn't be able to do that.
Right.
But they are.
So I know we're getting a little bit deeper into the podcast, and I want to shift gears a little bit and focus on the beauty side of things. And I know, I feel like I'm just getting too amped up and I could go on for hours.
Yeah.
But I want to talk a little bit about your experience underwater. Is there a particular defining moment that you, out of the millions I'm sure you have, that kind of sticks out as to how beautiful the ocean is and that you really know that you're doing the right thing?
I've been, first of all, incredibly fortunate to have some of the most amazing connections underwater. I've danced with, 18 oceanic manta rays on a seamount in Indonesia by myself. I've been with 15 tiger sharks within hands touching distance in the Bahamas. I've swam with orcas hunting sperm whales. I've been with blue whales, and I've seen so much of the greatness of the oceans. I think probably one of the most amazing experiences I ever had was 2009. When I was in Mexico, I had earlier that year been on a sailfish filming expedition. We were doing footage with National Geographic for a program, and our captain spoke about this whale shark gathering that would happen in the summer months. And I thought, whale shark gathering here? He said, yeah. We see maybe 10, 20, 30. And I'm like, no way. Because back then, seeing even one was, I think Cousteau saw one or two whale sharks in his entire life.
Oh, really?
So, yeah. It's only recent years where they've figured out where to find whale sharks. So I organized an expedition. We reviewed the captain's logs. We looked at triangulation around full moon and everything. And we said, we're going to go find them. And I told my friends about this aggregation that we're going to go find. And they kind of raised their eyebrows like, yeah, right? It's right off Cancun. If it was there, we would have found it.
Yeah.
And I remember heading out in the sea that morning and all bravo and bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. And then after about an hour, realizing it's a big ocean because it was like 10 miles off the shore.
Right.
And whale sharks aren't flying in the air. They're under the water.
Yeah.
So I'm cruising along and my friends are starting to look at me like, thanks. We got a week of this.
Yeah. Where's this aggregation you're talking about?
So I make it my duty to be extra diligent. I climb up on the Tuna tower, which is the lookout tower in a sport fishing boat. And I'm looking around and somewhere way miles in the distance, I see this splashing on the surface. And I call down to the captain. He's like, no, it's bonito, which is a type of tuna. And he's like, it's a bait ball. I'm like, okay. Cruising along 10 minutes later, and I look over, I'm like, it's still there. And he's like, no. And I said, no, wait a minute.
We're going over there.
Bait balls, these animals are ravenous. It takes a few minutes over. So we go cruising over there, and then everything's calmed down, and we just keep heading that direction. And I'm like, And then I remember staring at this blue water, and then suddenly, right in front of the boat, this giant dorsal fin comes up. I'm like, oh my gosh, and it's spotted. I'm like, whale shark, and then another, and then another, and then another, and then for like a mile, all we saw on this beautiful glassy sea was whale shark fins everywhere.
Wow.
And it was only us. And it was crystal clear blue water.
Oh,
and
my
I was
God.
grabbing my camera, and I fall in the water. And I realized the camera's not even the housing, and I roll over, and a whale shark bumps right into me, and then it was like incredible. I'm in the water, and everywhere are whale sharks crisscrossing in the blue right at the surface. And the irony of this whole thing is not irony. The craziness of it was 2 years before I talked to a friend about a vision I'd had of going out into the blue water off Mexico and finding an aggregation of whale sharks in the blue.
What?
And how crazy that would be. And I told friends about that, and they said,
Even
that's
before you
never
knew that those things even existed?
Years before I had ever heard about it.
Holy shit. That's some divine intervention right there.
Isn't that crazy?
That's
and so we
insane.
discovered, and I found out later that scientists had seen through aerial tracking, and they had been trying to figure out and triangulate it. But we're the first film documentaries to actually ever get in the water and actually film this thing. And then I spent years going down, triangulating, using GPS to actually learn how it worked. And it became the catalyst for a program we developed to convert the shark fishery, because the island Isla Mujeres is the biggest shark fishery off Mexico's eastern coast, to convert it. And, you know, as a result of the whale shark tourism, 80% of the longline fishermen gave up their gear and became whale shark guides.
Oh my God.
Just through tourism, we helped drive an industry, and people were like, "Oh, there's too many boats," and I'm like, "There can't be,
dude."
Boats.
Not to sound like I'm like a brown nose or anything like that. For the impact that you as one person has had is a mind blowing thing, and I think it's a really inspiring thing to anybody who would be looking to help that out, because it is such a. We do sometimes get into a very defeatist culture. Is there's global warming. Oh, how the hell am I going to help out? I mean, the fact that you finding that one thing and then in turn saying, oh, that's not good enough just for me to get pictures, but I'm going to go and try and change an entire culture. I mean, hats off, man. It's huge.
Everybody has that power. And, you know, I look at myself as a catalyst and a sort of that constant force, but it takes a community to make things happen. And one of the things that I've been so blessed is to have a community in different parts of the world of really passionate, capable people, from conservationists to filmmakers to even operators and businessmen and even fishermen, that come together around a vision. And my part is to help really inspire that vision and help connect them. And then they carry a lot of the weight, and they're the unsung heroes. But we build these teams that then carry the work forward. And, you know, what I like to think of is that I can help catalyze change in different areas. But really, let's not forget that the teams and the communities that are making the sacrifices every single day. But that's what change is about in 100%. The world. And that's the power that you have as an individual, is you can start things and you can join things and you can help make bigger things happen.
That's such a good place for a segue, but I want to go back because I'm still mind blown by the fact that all these whale sharks were together. Do they know why that was the case? Like what the behavior for why they're all gathering together at this? Is it often, or is it only at one point during the year? How many was it 20 to 30, or do you think it was more?
Yep. So I immediately, having worked with whale sharks and other species, I was like, well, if it's in open blue water, and this is before I began the expedition, it means that it's not going to be plankton fed. It's got to be fish eggs, because I'd done that in Belize. And given that it's out in the deep blue, it's got to be pelagic fish, not reef fish, is what I suspected. And that it would have to be a spawning event where the fish are releasing the eggs. So it would have to be around a full moon. And so I realized it's a spawning event of pelagic fish. I didn't know which and how. And lo and behold, we realized very quickly it was a species of tuna called little tunny that were spawning along a sort of a ridge line, deep underwater ridge line. And the release of those eggs was signaling on an annual basis, using the moon cycles, was signaling the whale sharks to come in and feed on these nutrient-rich eggs.
How does... God, I have so many questions. The fish and the whale sharks, is it just because of the gravitational pulls, or like, do the whale sharks actually look up and see the moon? Do you know what's going on there?
I think the moon drives the fish, because what you're looking to do is it's optimal to spawn at night when you're less susceptible to predators than during the daytime. right?
Mm-hmm.
But you need enough light to be able to find each other, and you need some kind of signaling event. So full moons historically have been great times for
That
fish
makes
to have
sense.
enough light and do that. And if there's no full moon, the spawning often won't happen. So that's an important thing with cloud cover and things. They believe, and this is all theoretical, because how does a whale shark predict to be in the right spot? And they believe that there is a frequency from the movement of either the eggs or the fish or both that is high frequency that travels a very long distance. And that frequency is a signal to the whale sharks to hone in, because the whale sharks are there when the spawning happens. They're not there after it. They're actually on site at the restaurant. And not only that, the whale sharks come from as far as Brazil, Western Africa, the Caribbean, Northern Gulf, North Carolina.
Holy shit.
To this one spot. And we're not talking a few. We're talking the highest we've seen was 470 whale sharks in one spot.
What?
470 whale sharks.
Oh my God.
Almost every season, 100 to 200. But
dude, this is what I'm talking about when people just like to the mind-blowing things that you find out about. And I'm understandably like pretty relatively well-versed compared to your normal person. I've never heard of anything like that. The more you learn, it's just that's so amazing on so many levels. I can't even it's awesome.
Isn't that crazy though?
It is.
Like, it's off Cancun, right? So you're talking about it's a metropolis with more sea activity than you could ever imagine. And how did we not know about this? And I often tell people, if you want to say give up hope, if there's that still going on, what else is still so prolific in the oceans? There's so much worth working to protect.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just yet to be discovered, but let's get ahead of it and really try to protect it.
Well, I think on top of that, what's scary about that, not to bring it on a negative note, is when you think of it happens clearly with whale sharks. I know it also happens with a lot of fish, snapper and tuna, but sperm whales too. They have these mass aggregation moments where if something were to go wrong in those areas, whether it be somebody looking to exploit them and kill them or just something, an oil rig coming through at the wrong time, I mean, that could decimate an entire species like that. You know what I mean? Like, that's a scary thought.
Yeah. I believe that I think back in time, there were these aggregations throughout the world of whale sharks. But I think the fishing fleets hammered a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And so you just have remnants. You have some in the Philippines that gather. You have Djibouti in the Gulf. There's other places. I think this is as far as you can get from the shark fisheries of China. And it's probably why it's the last of the great, great aggregations. So I think it's not,
Yeah. Jeez. Well, we got a few minutes left here. I'm going to go into some rapid fire questions as we wrap up here. If you could recommend any books for people to read that you think would be inspiring or just your favorite books, what would you recommend?
It's a lot. I'll go a little heavy on this one.
Okay.
I think we need as much informed people about the true state of the oceans and historically what's happened to them. There's a book called The Unnatural History of the Sea.
Okay.
And that book outlines from the beginning of time, it's a heavy read, what the oceans used to look like and then how we've impacted the oceans. And it feels to me like if we had more people really understand how abundant our coastal waters were, not just the open seas, they'd realize how far we've lost and how much more we need to do. So Unnatural History of the Sea would be one that I would definitely say would be one that I'd put high on the list. Another one would be Carl Safina, which is What Animals Think. And that one really talks about how to actually develop the empathy and connection that we've been talking about.
Oh, that's cool. I haven't heard of that one.
Yeah.
Outside of kind of the major documentaries that you've been involved with and a lot of people would recognize, how about a documentary that needs a little more attention that people should definitely go and check out?
Well, what may be commonplace in certain areas is not commonplace in other areas.
True.
I think a documentary is coming out right now by same director, Luis Ahoyas, who did Racing Extinction, called Game Changers.
Okay. Which
really talks about performance athletes and vegetarian or plant-based diet. Oh. It dispels all the myths about plant-based diets and also shows you a lot of the risks associated with meat diets. I think if everybody watched Game Changers, the plant-based diet thing we've talked about would have a lot more potential.
Interesting. I'm a big fan of The Cove too. I mean,
yep.
That guy's a rock star.
He's a rock star. And his latest film's coming out, Game Changers. Keep an eye for that.
When is it coming out? Do you know?
They should have a distribution deal any day now.
Okay.
It's already in film festivals. It was very prominent at Sundance.
Oh, awesome.
Amazing, amazing film.
Awesome.
Louis is a rock star.
Yeah, unbelievable. How about your next 5 years? What's coming up?
Doing everything I can to get people to fall in love with the oceans and protect them. And so that ranges from a lot of work in Indonesia, Latin America, taking on the big tuna and industrial fishing industries, global protection for sharks and rays, continued work in that area. There's so much to be done. I can't even list it in one conversation.
Okay, that's good to know. We'll keep an eye out. And if you could put a billboard on the side of the highway that disseminated one message in 10 words or less, what would you say?
I'd say we are part of nature. And in protecting nature, we protect ourselves.
I like that.
We don't go to nature. We are part of nature.
I think that's an important thing that's oftentimes misunderstood.
Exactly.
We're all part of it.
We're all part.
So I'm going to link to your website, Instagram, social channels, etc.
Yep.
Where else can people look to find some of your work?
BlueSphereFoundation.org to look at the conservation programs that are most immediate right now. Instagram obviously is a great place, and Facebook to see where I'm, what's going on lately kind of thing, right? And then another group that I'm a very close part of is Sea Legacies.
Okay.
Which is Paul Nicklin and Christina Mittermeier, both top National Geographic photographers. I'm working in the collective as well with that team.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, that group is talking about rock stars too.
They're rock stars.
Oh my God.
They're blue stars.
Definitely. Well,
water stars, not rock stars. You got water stars.
Water stars. Well, thank you so much, man. Shawn, it's been really, really fun. And thank you for all the work that you do. It's so important and really, really appreciate it. And the fact that you take a couple hours to chat with me on the podcast means a lot. So thank you again.
You're welcome.
Awesome. And to everybody else, like I said before, please check out Shawn's work. I'll link it in the show notes. And until next time, be wild. Thank you so much for listening. I honestly cannot express how much I appreciate you taking the time. For all information regarding this episode's guest, social channels, books, how you can support, etc., please check out our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to the podcast. We are everywhere that you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Escape the Zoo on YouTube, follow Escape the Zoo on Instagram, like Escape the Zoo on Facebook, and please share with your friends. It honestly goes so far and means so much to me. And lastly, if you'd like to be emailed with each new podcast and any other major Escape the Zoo updates, visit escapethezoo.tv and sign up for our email list. Thank you.